What may I get for you this evening?
I think
I'll order for us. We will split the absolute perfection, but instead of anxiety, could I get a flawless side of raised expectations, please?
Of course. And how would you like your circumstances?
Micromanaged? Micromanaged. Oh, and please tell the chef that no matter how well he prepares it, I'll still be dissatisfied.
Will do.
Oh, and can we get some 38% shinier silverware?
Yes, sir.
What a close to but not quite perfect evening.
Good morning, Lebanon Baptist Church. Good to see all of you here today. If you're joining us on our live stream or online, if you're watching there or if you're listening to our podcast, we're glad to have you with us listening to this and viewing this today as well. Well, let me start today with this. I got a little confession to make, I struggle just slightly with control issues. I know you would not believe that, and you would not think that, and you would say that's got to be the furthest thing from the truth. Anybody else would just make me feel like I'm not alone today, and anybody else would say you struggle just slightly with control issues? Yeah, Tani, Luke's told me that about you. A few of you struggle with control issues. Perfect. Good. So this message is for all of y'all today, okay? Yeah, my wife would tell you, she would tell you, Matt struggles a little bit with control issues. She would tell you that a little bit. But Brendan would probably tell you the same thing as well about me. Just this past week, just a little story. He and I went down together to Wesley Long Hospital to visit someone in the hospital, and then we left there and we went over to Cone to visit someone, and we were pushed for time, and so he said, why don't you just pull up and hop out and go in, and I'll take the car, and I'll go park the car and just come back and pick you up. And so, all right, yeah, that'll work. So we hopped out. I hopped out. He went over, as he was getting ready to get in, I said, hey, real quick, just remember, this car has a really wide turning radius, so you might think you can get in that space, and you can't. All right, so just be aware of that. He hopped in, pulled off, comes back, picks me up later. I'm like, all right, you just drive. So I hop in the passenger seat. We go up there to pull out from the hospital. I said, I would probably go left here. I wouldn't go, I'd go left here, right? Yeah, go left. All right, hey, this lane is going to be ending up here in just a little bit, right? You might want to go ahead and get over. Pull into the church parking lot. I usually take that speed bump a little slower. Ask him about that. Yeah, just... Ask Brendan about that this week. Yeah, I struggle a little bit with control issues. Maybe you're there. Some of you can identify with that. Today, we are going to talk about, really a lot about what this song resounds that we were just singing. We're going to talk about trust as we're continuing our series on decisions that dramatically impact your whole life. We're going to talk about the importance to choose to trust God and to trust others. And in that, giving up control of what we cannot control. This is so important. We all have a choice to make. And remember, this series that we're in is all about the power of positive choosing. Remember, positive thinking is great, but it goes right out of the window when we make bad choices. That is what impacts our lives. And so this is about positive choosing. Deuteronomy 30, verse 19 has kind of been our theme verse for this series, where Moses said to the people of Israel in this sermon before he left them and before they went into the promised land, he said, "Today I invoke heaven and earth as witnesses against you that I have set life and death, blessing and curse before you. Therefore choose" what? Life. Choose life so that you and your descendants will live. Today I want to try to encourage you with the importance of what it means to choose to trust. To choose to trust. Last week, we talked about what it means to choose to take responsibility in life. That is so important. The week before, we talked about what it means to choose to make first things first, to live life with priorities and keep those in balance. But choosing to take responsibility and choosing to trust God go really hand in hand. We'll see that, I believe, as we walk through this today. So let me say this. If you want to take notes on the back of the bulletin, there's a little outline. You can fill out some things there. I want to start with this. People who trust God and others with the issues of life live with a stable, calm resolve that cannot be found in anything other than trust. I mean, if you've lived life long enough, and if you've struggled with control issues, and if you've looked at other people who seem to be able to trust God and trust others more than you seem to be able to do, you know that you've seen in other people that. You've seen that. You've seen people that just seem to maintain this sense of calmness and stability and this resolve in the midst of like terrible difficulties and circumstances all around them. It's because they've learned to trust. You can't find that stable, calm resolve in anything other than learning to trust God. I want you to see just 2 verses in Psalm 125. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn them on, or you can turn to Psalm 125, or if you need to pick up one of the Bibles in the back of the pew in front of you, grab one of those Bibles out of the back of the pew. You'll find it on page 485 in the Pew Bible. Psalm 125. You ought to mark this verse, highlight this verse, commit this verse to your thinking and memory today. Just these 2 verses here that are so powerful and so profound that I want to encourage you with today. Makes this same statement that we're looking at. Psalm 125 and verses 1 and 2, and this is what we call one of the songs of ascents. And so as the people of Israel would ascend up to go to worship, they would go through dangerous, difficult places, but they would remind themselves along the way with what they called songs of ascent. They would sing these songs to each other and together to remind themselves of God and His protection. And this is what they sang. Look at verses 1 and 2. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but abides forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds His people, not just for a little while, but from this time forth and forevermore. Forevermore. That is a powerful, powerful passage of Scripture. You want to be stable in life? Calm when everything around you is falling apart? It comes from learning to trust in the Lord. I'm going to talk to you for just a minute here about something that this is something that God has been teaching me very profoundly for the past 3 years. Came to this church first Sunday of January 3 years ago, 2017. About 3 or 4 weeks after coming to the church here, I found out that my grandmother had fallen and had broken her hip, was going into the hospital, or had gone into the hospital already, had had surgery, and had been placed in a rehab facility. My grandfather, he was struggling with continual decline in his cognitive ability up in his late 80s. My dad was living at home. He was an only child. He was living at home with his parents, my grandparents at the time, and I was getting phone calls at that same time that he was not able to take care of himself. And so for about the past 3 years, I've been serving as the primary caretaker and provider for my grandmother, my grandfather, and my dad. Those first 6 months, I thought my life was over. And I hit a low place in life that I've never experienced before, and I pray to God I never go to again. It was like the weight of all of this was just too much to handle. I remember going down to the nursing home where my grandmother was at for the rehab, and she had dementia. She didn't even recognize who I was. gone through all of that process. And I went down to visit her, and the people in the home there, they came and they handed me this stack of paperwork, and they said, your grandmother's insurance is not paying for her rehab anymore. It's already cut out. And if you don't get Medicaid approval for her within the next week, we're going to have to discharge her. But she can't go home to live with, where she was, because it's not safe for her to go there. We'll be calling the state to go in and seek protective custody over your grandmother. So you need to get all this done in the next few days. And I remember just coming back. I remember just coming back from that experience and just crumbling under the weight of all of that. Back in October, slowly over time, we were able to take care of things, get things in place, get things in position, get her taken care of, get her cared for. Eventually, about a year later, was able to get my grandfather moved in with her, even though he didn't want to go at the time. And then was able to get my dad taken care of as well. And back in October, my grandmother passed away. And then just this past week, on Monday morning, my grandfather passed. I think I thought I was a little more ready to talk about this than I was. Last Sunday, let me back up. Thursday a week ago, went down to the nursing home where my grandfather was, and we had to make the decision to call in hospice. And he had a tumor that was growing, and it was causing him a lot of pain, and he was just at the point where he wasn't strong enough to be operated on. And so we made the decision to bring in hospice care, and sat there and talked with him for a few hours and explained all that to him. And then I knew it was getting close. It could be a few weeks, could be a couple months even, but we knew it was getting close. And so we went down on Sunday night, took the boys, took Leah, Allison, we all went down to spend some time with them Sunday night. And these are some pictures from our time together that Sunday night last week, just a week ago. And we sat and we talked, and he's eating a fig Newton and drinking orange juice, and we had originally planned on going Monday morning. Our plan was to go Monday morning. It just felt like, for whatever reason, no, we ought to go Sunday. So we went down Sunday, spent Sunday evening with him, left 7:30, somewhere around there, left, and I told him I'd be back to see him, because I thought I would. I thought I'd be able to come back. He looked like he was doing fairly strong under the circumstances, and was, alert. And Monday morning, the next morning, we left that Sunday night. The next morning, 5 o'clock, they called and said that he passed away in his sleep. He just didn't wake back up. So this week, I've done a lot of reflecting over the past 3 years, and even the past 30 years, looking at pictures and just thinking about life. And I'll never forget, I was sitting with him on that Thursday morning, and we were talking, and the nurse came in and brought him his wallet. He'd filed a complaint that his wallet somebody had taken it, and it had just been found in the laundry. And that apparently had happened like dozens of times. But they brought his wallet back into him, and it was just looking at, he had some pictures in his wallet that were 60 years old. Literally, a picture of him holding my dad when my dad was 1, 60 years old. It had held up. These things had held up through the washing machine and everything. They were still there. And we're just sitting there, and he just made this statement on Thursday, just looked at that and looked at me, and he just said, "Where is all the time gone?" Where has all the time gone? As I've been thinking back over the past even 3 years of the weight of all of this and what I've had to just kind of go through, kind of hitting that low spot, very low spot. It was like I finally got to a place where what I realized was I had a responsibility there. I was taking responsibility in the situation 3 years ago to do what I needed to do, what I should do. This is what I can do. This is what I have to do. But then this is what I can't do. And it was like the clouds finally broke as I learned to live in that place of here's what I can do and will do, but here's what I just can't do that's outside of my control. I'll do what I can. I'm not going to blow off my responsibility, but I have to let go of everything else. That's what we're talking about today. Learning last week to take responsibility for what we should, but today to learn to trust God and to trust others with all that other stuff that's just outside of our control. People who trust God and trust others with the issues of life, they live with that stable, calm resolve that can't be found in anything else. Psalm tells us that, Psalm 125, those that trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but abides forever. You know, the words translated trust in the Bible, different words that are translated into the word trust, literally means a bold, confident security and action based on that security. Okay? So it's like you have this sense of security and confidence in someone or something, and then you act based on that security. It's not the same thing as faith. Sometimes we think trust and faith are the same thing, but there's a little difference between trust and faith. It's not exactly the same thing. Faith is that gift of God in Ephesians 2 that we read about. Trusting is something different. Trust is what we do because of the faith that we have been given. Trust is believing in the promises of God in all circumstances, even in those where the evidence seems to be contrary. You ever been there? Where it's like all the evidence of around you is like, how can I keep trusting God in the midst of this? Trust is maintaining that confidence and security in the Lord, even when everything around you, all the evidence says you should give up trust. It is by this trust that we are promised God gives us peace. Isaiah 26 verse 3 says, you will keep in peace him or her, that man or woman, that one that belongs to you. Isaiah says, God will keep the one in peace whose mind is steadfast. Why? Because he trusts in you. That's what Isaiah says about trusting in the Lord. That God will keep your mind in peace and steadfast because you trust in God. Philippians 4, 6 and 7 says it to us like this. I believe we have that on the screen. It tells us, do not be anxious about anything. Hey, how many of you would say that's a lot easier said than done? But in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Peace that comes when we trust God and we give up the control of things that are outside of our control. Not being anxious about it, but choosing instead to let God take care of that and to give up that control. Now I want to say, the Bible makes it very clear that God grants us this peace that passes understanding, and I've talked to dozens of people throughout life and ministry who have gone through some of the most incredibly difficult circumstances and have had that calm, steady, stable resolve and peace in the midst of it. And I've talked to many who have just said, if I didn't have that trust in God, that relationship with God, I don't know how in the world I can make it through this. I've talked to many people that have gone through that, and they say that same thing. There's just a peace that cannot be explained. And I look at others who don't believe or don't have a relationship with God, and I wonder, how in the world can they make it through or cope? How could they cope with something like this apart from God? That's true. The one that has that trust in God, it has that stable resolve. But I think the other is also true. I've seen this. Some of the most miserable people I've ever known have been people who were suspicious or skeptical of everything and everyone and just didn't trust God or trust anyone else. Some of the most miserable people I've ever seen are the people who don't trust anyone. You know, they go through all of life, crawling through life, miserable, because they just don't trust. They have to control everything. And they live with that anxiety. You want to be miserable? Just don't trust God or anyone. And you'll slowly, painfully crawl through life. Today I want to encourage you to choose to trust God. This is how I would say it. I choose. All right, I choose. This is what you need to decide to do. This will dramatically impact your life. You need to choose to trust God and others, okay? That releases you of the anxiety to control things which are outside of your control. That's what I want to encourage you to do. Choose to trust God. Realize, okay, here's all the things I can take responsibility for, and I will and I should. Boom. On this side's everything I can't. It's outside of my control. It's outside of my abilities. I'm going to just trust God with that. I'm going to commit it to Him. I'm going to do what I can. I'm going to take responsibility, but I'm going to give everything else to God. I'm going to let that go. It's going to release you of the anxiety to control things. How many of you have ever heard of the story of Dave Dravecki? Anybody ever heard of Dave Dravecki? 1, 2, 3. Okay, a few. Dave Dravecki was a left-handed all-star pitcher for the San Francisco Giants. And in 1988, he had half of his deltoid muscle removed because they found a cancerous tumor. So he removed half of his deltoid muscle in his throwing, in his pitching arm. And doctors saying you'll never come back. He'll never be able to return to Major League Baseball. He only has half of a deltoid muscle. The next year in 1989, after intensive rehab and working and going back through the minor system, in 1989, on August 10th, he returned to the majors against all the odds. And he pitched 8 innings and got a win. 8 innings. 5 days later, he was pitching again, had a pretty good game going. He had pitched a no-hitter the first 3 innings and then came into the 6th inning. And in the 6th inning, as he faced the third batter, Tim Raines, on his first pitch to the third batter in the 6th inning, his humerus bone snapped in half, and they said you could hear it throughout the stadium. It's horrific to watch it. There's video, and it's just hard to watch. It was broke, and then the hopes of playing were pretty much done again. Later that season, not too much longer after that, his team, the Giants, they won the pennant. And running out to celebrate with the team on the mound, he broke it again. Went into the doctors, they found out the cancer had come back, and they actually wound up, over time, they removed his entire left arm. Now, a few more people know Dave's story, but less people know about his wife's story, Jan. In college, I was doing a case study on depression and anxiety, and I read her story. She's written a biography called A Joy I'd Never Known, and she chronicles during that time her experience with panic attacks and clinical depression, just not being able to control things, and that's what she learned through all of that, was the only way to have real joy was to release control, to give up control of the things that she could not control. A joy I'd never known, she wrote. She found her joy in Christ as she learned to let go and give up what was outside of her control. That's what choosing to trust God will do for us. That's what Psalm 125 is all about. And then there's one other passage I want you to see this morning, and then I'll give you a couple practical points about how to do this. I want you to flip over just a few pages to Proverbs to the right. Proverbs chapter 3. That's just 10 pages to the right if you're in the Pew Bible. Proverbs chapter 3. This is probably the most well-known, popular couple verses encouraging us, commanding us to trust in not ourselves, but to trust in God. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Some that have grown up in church their whole life could probably quote these verses. Some of you, this may be new to you today, but this is what it says. It tells us, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, as opposed to what? All right, do not, and don't do this, do not lean on your own understanding. See, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. What does this passage teach us? It teaches us to trust what? First and foremost in the Lord. That's who we are to trust in. That is where our trust is to be. We're not to trust in ourselves. We're not to lean on our own understanding. We're to first and foremost trust in the Lord, okay? The Almighty One, the all-powerful One, the one that raised Lazarus, the one that is the miracle worker, the one that can make the way. That's the one we're to trust in, to hope in. The Lord, not ourselves, not our plans, not the world's wisdom, not the devices of the world. We're not to trust in any of that stuff. We're to trust in the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. Going through all of that 3 years ago, I never was more stressed in all my life trying to deal with that than when I would read articles that I found off Google searching stuff. It's like more and more anxiety from all that, more and more to do, more and more to do. It was through going back to the Scriptures, through reading the Psalms, through realizing that ultimately at the end of all of it, when it's all said and done, God is the one that is in control. He is the all-powerful one, and I have to ultimately trust in Him. It's in the Lord, first of all. Second of all, we're told to trust with all of our heart. It's with all my heart. That means every part of my life. It's because of God's nature that we're encouraged to trust in Him with all of our hearts. You know, you can trust the Lord. In His nature, He is good. In His nature, He is kind and gracious and merciful. You can trust in the Lord with all of your heart, all of it. Not just part of it, but everything. Not like this part of my life I'm going to keep to myself. I'm going to try to handle this part, and this part I'll trust. No, it's all of our life that we're supposed to. Every part of it we are to trust the Lord with. And then it's not in my understanding. Not in my understanding. Because it is what? It's finite, it's temporal, and it's tainted by sin. We're encouraged to trust in the Lord with every part of who we are and not to trust in ourselves. Why? Not to trust in our own abilities to think or to make sense of things or to understand things. Why? Because our understanding is finite. That means it's not infinite like God's. Ours is finite. It's limited. We don't know it all. Google doesn't either. Our limited understanding, we're finite. Our minds, we think temporally. We don't think eternally like we ought to. And so when we begin to trust in ourselves, we have a very short-term perspective. And then, our understanding is tainted by sin. We can't really trust our own wisdom like we can trust the wisdom of God. That's who we're encouraged to trust in. Those who choose to trust in life give up control. They learn to do that. I don't believe this is a one-time decision. You can make it, set it, and forget it. This is continually, as you go through life, having to go through this process, reminding yourselves. That's why we sing the songs like we just sung a few minutes ago, to remind ourselves of that, because we forget. You'll go out of here this week, you'll forget. You'll forget about it. I want to encourage you to trust. Trust in the Lord, not in your own understanding, and trust with your whole heart. How do you do that? Let me just practically, how do you do that? Now, these aren't in the notes, but you can write these down. I think these will be very helpful to you. Well, you begin to exhibit certain habits. There's about 7 habits that another person I came across this week said they've read and studied and looked at so many people who trust God. They have this radical, like uncommon trust in God. And they said after reading biographies and talking to people and interviewing people, they said we found these 7 habits that people who trust God in radical, unreasonable ways, they exhibited these habits. Number 1, they accepted suffering. They just accepted it. They didn't expect that life was going to be easy. They accepted suffering's going to be part of living in a world that's full of sin, that's all around us. They accepted it. They know, those that trust God, this is practical. You trust God, you learn to accept suffering. You know that trials are going to come in this life, but your trust doesn't waver because it's based on faith in the promises of God. God promises eternal joy with the Lord. He promises us an inheritance that can never perish. Our hope and our trust transcends this life. They accept suffering. Number two, they accept the inevitability of death. They accept the inevitability of death. In other words, they live with a heavenly worldview. They know death is coming. Life is short, but eternity is forever. And they live life with that perspective, knowing that there's a lot more to this than just what happens in a few short years here on earth. Number three, they have daily appointments with God. They have daily appointments with God. In other words, their relationship with God is not reduced to just a Sunday morning relationship. Their relationship with God is not just they reconnect on Sunday when they sing and listen to Him through the Word. It's daily. They have a relationship. And then fourth, in prayer, they listen more than they talk. They listen more than they talk. Let me tell you, that's a challenge for you and for me especially. In prayer, do you listen to God? Are you sitting in prayer with the Scriptures, reading and listening to Him more than you're talking? In other words, those that have learned to trust God radically, they've made prayer more than just a list of requests that they offer to Him. It's really a relationship. And then fifthly, they limit distractions. They limit distractions. They don't allow things to just interrupt their thinking and their time with God. They limit distractions. Some of us are, I believe, today so distracted by everything that's not important, that we really can't take time to focus on what really does matter to develop that relationship with God. They limit distractions. You can't connect with God if you're constantly being distracted and interrupted. They limit those. We are truly amusing ourselves to death, and it is true that we oftentimes today, because of all the noise, we don't stop and think about what matters most until it's too late. But people who have learned to radically trust God, they've limited those so they can hear God, speak to God, develop that relationship that builds upon trust. Number six, they submit their discernment to others. They submit their discernment to others. In other words, if a person who really radically trusts in God, they believe there's something they need to do, a decision they need to make, a course of action they need to take, and they're convinced of that, they believe that, this is what God would want me to do, they still submit that to others. They call up, they bring in, they ask for advice and counsel from other wise, mature Christians who also have radical trust in God. They test it by them, seeking advice and input before just moving forward without asking for advice. And then seventhly, lastly, they offer to God their complete and unhesitating obedience. People that radically trust in God do this. They do this. They just obey God. If it's clear God says it or commands it, they obey. Why? Because they trust God more than themselves. They trust God more than their desires or feelings. They know God knows better. So they just trust that what His Word asks them to do and tells them to do, if it's from God, it's clear, I just do it, I don't hesitate, I obey. And that develops that trust with the Lord that makes us stable and secure no matter what happens. Let me tell you a good example. If you want to read like a biography, a story, an incredible story of someone that has experienced this, that would be a good example for you to follow. Look up a book called God's Smuggler. God's Smuggler. It's a story about a guy named, they call Brother Andrew. He was a missionary, Christian missionary from the Netherlands, born in 1928, and tells all these stories about going into God. He was God's smuggler. He literally, in 1955, he started a ministry as a missionary, smuggling Bibles into these communist countries. And he has these incredible stories of learning to trust God through some of the most imaginably difficult situations and circumstances where his life was threatened. And it's an incredible read. God's Smuggler. That's what followers of Christ who demonstrate radical trust in God do. They just obey. Now, let me give you this by way of application, okay? You may have heard this before, but there's a prayer, and it's on the back of your bulletin. It's called the Serenity Prayer. And this is what I'm asking you to do this week. I'm asking you to do one thing this week, okay? Just do one thing. Can everybody do one thing? Can y'all do one thing? All right. It's called the Serenity Prayer. Do this one thing, but I want you to do it 3 times a day. All right, can you do that? All right, now you say, whoa, whoa. All right, this is incredible because this is what we're talking about between balancing responsibility and trust. And this was written and formed by an American theologian, Reynold Niebuhr, back in 1934. He popularized this and put it together. But this is the prayer that we got to live life with. You got to remind yourself of this. God, grant me the serenity. What is that? Serenity is that calmness, peace, or composure. You substitute a word in there that you understand. God, grant me the peace. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. If you can learn to pray that prayer and to live life with that thought, that mentality, trying to figure that out and getting from God, not from yourself, but from God, that wisdom that helps you sort between the two, that decision managed over a lifetime will radically impact every part of who you are.